Hello, my fellow Ragers, and welcome to yet another outwardly, you know it, experience. So, today we will be learning how to create an extended player class to add more data to the class. For instance, we already have our server defined class player, which contains a lot of variables, which defines the attributes for the players. But let's say we want to add more variables, more things to define for the player, like let's say admin. Let's say you have a drug system, so drugs, weapons, etc., etc. So first we will create a class, but before that let me just add another folder where we will create the class. So add new folder, and we will call this player. And inside this folder player, let's add a class called, come on, data.cs. Let me just add the namespace using GTA Network API. Now, this is our class data. What we're going to do is we're going to add variables. These variables are going to be an instance of an object, so it will not be static. So let's start with, let's say, admin. Any player, it could be a normal player or an admin. So first we'll add public. Admin has to be an integer, so int admin level. Now, instead of like except admin, what else can we write? Let's add cache. So for cache, I'll keep it private. Private int cache. And let's add another thing, which is public bool first spawned. This variable is going to define whether or not the player who just connected and spawned, did they spawn for the first time or did they got killed and then spawned. So basically this variable first spawn will determine if it was a spawn or a respawn. Cache is self-explanatory, how much cache the player has, and let's say you want to create admin commands, then you're going to need a variable which defines whether or not the player is an admin. Now we have our variables done. You can add more depending on how or what you're making the system. Now we will use a function from the player class that is already defined. The function is set data, get data, reset data, and has data. Now for that we are going to need a key. That key is going to be a string, and it is obviously going to be a constant because we do not want the value for the key to change. Think of it like a dictionary. A dictionary has a key and a value. So we will make the key inside this class itself. So public const is basically a keyword for constant. It won't change the value. So public const string and data identifier is equals to, we'll give a value. Let's say the value for the identifier is going to be player data identifier. Now, we'll make a constructor because whenever we create an object from the class data, we want that all of the variables have a default value. So, public data, and to define that we are using the very instance, like let's say you created an object. Now you want to access the elements of that object you just created. To access that object from within the class, you need a keyword called this. This dot admin level is equals to 0. That means whenever I create the object, by default, the admin level is going to be 0. This dot cache is equals to 0, and this dot first spawned is equals to be true. That means whenever a player connects, that will be their first spawn. After they spawn, it's going to be false, and then it's going to be respawn. So understand the difference between spawn and respawn. Spawn is when they connect and spawn for the first time, and respawn is basically whenever they die and then they spawn. That is a respawn. Now that we have our class ready, we need to create the object. We will create the object inside, where is it? Main, and in the server event, player connected. Now you can see that there's a red mark over here. This is basically a conflict. We have created a folder named player, and this already defined player which comes with the API, GTA Network API, there's a clash. So we need to define the namespace for this. The namespace is GTA Network API dot player. This is basically to avoid confusion. The compiler is basically confused right now that which player is the programmer trying to access. Is it the player from the GT Network API or is it the player that we just created in the folder? So to avoid the confusion, we just added the namespace as well. Now, in the server event on player connected, we are going to create the object of this newly created class, which contains all of our extra data. We go back to our main. First, we will check if the player object, which is in the server event function player over here, the parameter, we're going to check if the object already exists or not. So if, what was it? Player dot data dot, oh wait, no, it has to be the normal player. So GTA network API dot player dot, oh come on, what am I doing? Is the variable player. Player dot has data, and then we will check in has data. We need to give the parameter the key, which we need to from that key. It's going to retrieve the data, the value. In this case, the value is an object of the class data, and the identifier for that object is data identifier. So we will use that as the key. So now player dot has data, and then we will write player dot data identifier. Now if the player client, the client, I'll just call this client, if the client already has that data, we are going to reset the data. So player dot reset data, and then again the identifier. So player, oops, the folder name is player dot, the class is data, and the variable is data identifier. So now over here we're checking if the object already exists in the client. If it does exist, then we will reset the data, and then we will create the object. So player dot set data, and the generic type is going to be the class which we're going to store. So player dot data. And this set data needs two parameters. The first is the key, and the second is the value. The value is going to be the object that we will create. So first, let me add the key. The key is this player.data.data identifier. So folder, class, and the variable, which is a constant. Keep in mind. Now the value. The value is basically the object we will create from the class data. So let me just create a new player.data, and there we go. Player's the namespace, but it's okay. Wait. Player commands 10. Player commands 10. Oh, over here as well. There's a conflict again. Basically, we have a player folder, and there's also player in the GTA Network API. So to avoid confusion, again, GTA Network API. Did I spell it wrong? Yes, I did. There we go. Now it's gone. Now we have created the object and we have stored it in the client. Now what we will do is we are going to go back to our class data and we will create getter functions and setter functions. So let's start. First of all, the getter and setter functions, I'm going to make it static because I do not want to create an object to access these functions, because I'll pass the client in the parameters. So public static void, no, bool return first spawn value. So if I access this, then it will return this value, and the parameter is going to be GTA network API dot player, and the identifier for the variable is going to be player, and return, we're just going to use the function get data. So player dot get data, and the generic type again would be this. Oh no, wait. The generic type is going to be the class data. So data. Now this function requires only one parameter, the identifier. So data identifier and then dot first spawned. So what we are doing, what's wrong? Okay, what we're doing over here is we have created a getter function which returns a Boolean data type, and it is a static function. That means we do not need to create an object. How will we use this? We will call the function and then pass the client. And then the client, inside the client, we are going to check if the data exists. Which data? The object that we created in onPlayerConnect over here. And then after that we'll retrieve the data, and then from that object we will fetch the first spawn variable and then return it. And we will also make a setter function, so public static void set first spawn value, and the parameters for this is going to be the client or the player. In the case of version 1.1, it's no longer client, it's player, but I'll still call it client for now to avoid any confusion. Let me just copy this part, copy, paste, and then the value. And since first spawn the data type is Boolean, so the value's data type is also going to be bool, and then value. I'll copy this. Oh, come on. Copy and paste. So what we did over here is we're taking the client, we're fetching the data depending on the identifier. So basically we're fetching the object of class data, and then we're fetching the variable. After we fetch the variable, we're assigning the value that we got from the parameter of the function set first spawn value, and then we're assigning it. Now any object is reference type. So basically, if you change any value, it will be directly reflected to wherever the object is stored. So I do not need to again use set data. This get data is enough. Now let's utilize this getter and setter function. We will head back to our main CS, main class, and over here you can see there's a function, an event, which is on player spawn. Over here we will determine whether the player has spawned for the first time or the player has respawned. So over here I'll do if player dot data dot return first spawn value, and then I'll pass the parameter of the client, or also known player. If the player has spawned for the first time, because the constructor has first spawned as true, so whenever the player connects and the object is created, first spawn will always be true. So if the first spawn is true, then we will say that the player has spawned. Instead of writing respawned, we will just write the player has spawned. Now we need to also change the value, because if the player respawns again, the first spawn value will still be true. So it will still print the player has spawned instead of player has respawned. So let us set the value of first spawn to false. Player dot data dot set first spawn value, then the client, then the value, I'll make it false. So now if the player dies and spawns again, it'll trigger the server event on player spawn. It'll check the first spawn value, but since the player has already spawned for the first time and the value becomes false, so the else part would trigger. Instead of this, since it is false, this part will not get triggered. The else part will get triggered. And over here, I'll simply write the player has respawned. And this is how you create a custom defined class and create an object where you can store more attributes for the player. And let's test it out. Give me a moment and I'll start the game and show it to you. And now, as you can see, we are in game. And this is what has been written in the console, the text chat. Sorry, not the console, the text chat. Skylar Parker has spawned. But now that when the object has been created, the variable has been set to true for spawn. And once the player spawns, it says that the player has spawned, and then the first spawn becomes false. So if I try to respawn, I created a command called kill just so that I can demonstrate what happens when a player respawns. When I do kill and the player respawns, instead of saying that the player has spawned, now it's saying that Skylar Parker has respawned. So let me try it again. And voila, still it says that the player has respawned. So this is how a custom class is used. You make a custom class, give it variables, and then create an object and store it in the player client with the help of the function set data, and then use get data to fetch all the variables and set or alter the values, and then use it to do anything, to make any system at all. So if you learned anything in this video, then hit that like button, subscribe for more tutorials, and peace out.